Hello and welcome to this Amuse Bouche for Year 9 Power and Conflict Poetry. Although students are looking at that bracket term of power and conflict, there's actually quite a lot of different versions of that within that particular concept or concepts. So students are really sort of exploring the nuances of power and conflict within this scheme, and they're thinking about the different voices. And I think understanding that they're looking at voices that are dated from the 19th century, for instance, to those voices that are more contemporary to them, but they're equally all discussing the same idea. And it's that understanding that the context almost frames the voice, and helping students to understand that can really unlock meaning in this scheme. Before coming into Year 9, students have had an opportunity to look at poetry as a genre, but equally to think about different voices. They've looked at aspects of power, they've looked at the presentation of love, and they've thought about how relationships are conveyed within poetry, as well as different conflicts as well. And I think at this stage, students are beginning to really refine their skills of poetry. So things like technical knowledge, when we look at the phrase content, they'll have a greater security of that now, and we're beginning to really get into thinking about different concepts. The shortened length of poems lends itself to an opportunity for students to almost kind of like reduce their cognitive load of having to track backwards and forwards in a long piece of prose, to really think about how the writer's almost concise nature of picking up the right word to convey meaning can be really purposeful. So it's a great opportunity to really develop those AO2 skills that they'll need later in Year 11 and Year 10. So I think the main difference, apart from looking at technical content, is their understanding of key and threshold concepts. So in Year 7, for instance, when they looked at poetry, they would have thought about the consequence of conflict, or they might have talked about the conflict between humanity and nature, and they might have thought that the writer had a conscious construction. And then when they progress to Year 8, they think about the conscious construction actually now speaking to a social context, and the framing of that actually is exploring an injustice like gender roles or imbalances in society. But in Year 9, there's a strengthening of that understanding that the writer has done something or wants to communicate an idea with us, to really thinking about it now being a social critique. So if you think about poets like Shelley, for instance, and they're talking about hierarchy and the abuse of power, and how they're actually attacking institutions within society like the government and the church, students now are beginning to think that actually the pen becomes almost a weapon for these. It's a way of fighting back, and that's a slight sort of deviation really from the sort of Year 8 and Year 7. Slightly different from previous schemes, but the theme vocabulary is kind of designated for every single poem that they study so far. So you'll see that you've got the key vocabulary against each of those key poems, but you've also key concepts. And that's not to say that some of these key concepts, are like linked to every single poem. It's just that these are the key concepts that students will explore. We should be making note of them in our delivery, and these are the words that we need to be able to get the students to use in order to articulate that concept within the poem. The booklet itself is structured so that students are given a kind of autobiographical, even social context of the writer and the poem itself. They then think about the key motif, how that links to the poem, and then key quotations, normally 3 key quotations taken from the poem. And it reflects that structure with every single poem, and it's encouraging students to understand, when we think back to that phrase content about social critique, how the writer is writing this not in a place of isolation, but from their own context, and using that to discuss, in this case, key themes like the abuse of power. So once they understand the motif, or they understand the main concept of it, they're able to then approach the text itself and explore how the writer communicates that through methods like language, for instance, and structure. And then they begin to re-zoom in and analyse 3 key quotations for that particular poem. So just in terms of what this looks like, you can see here that this is the ones taken from the prelude, but the contextual information that I had in the booklet is being used to form a task. So it won't be that the students get the task in their booklet, it will be presented on the PowerPoint itself. So here they've just got to choose 4 key statements that are true based upon their reading of the biographical context of Wordsworth. I mentioned earlier on about vocabulary and how to get students to really talk about conceptual vocabulary and how that's been sort of pinpointed for each of the key poems that we're about to look at during the scheme. This activity here is a way of enabling students to unpick unfamiliar vocabulary, which is really critical, and actually it's a key activity that you'll see in Year 7 and Year 8 when students are approaching text, especially where the language seems a little bit archaic or a bit dated, and they need a bit of support doing so and getting them to understand the tone of it, so we're able to kind of identify the word within the context of the quotation and then begin to identify the tone. Then students are going to be more successful and be more independent in their analysis. It's also important to note that within the scheme, even though we're looking at power and conflict poetry, there's always an opportunity to redevelop their creative writing skills, whether that's through stimuli like an image, for instance, or maybe a piece of transactional writing as well. But again, using what they've understood in the poem can be a really good way of embedding writers' methods in terms of understanding about why the writers use that, but equally their own crafting. So if they're approaching this image of a boat on a lake, what words could they perhaps magpie from the poem itself? But more importantly, I think, was there a piece of imagery that they could perhaps use? So, for instance, in the prelude, the natural imagery or imagery related to light that Wordsworth uses, how could that be used within their own piece of creative writing? And that will only solidify their crafting, but their understanding of the intention behind that crafting. In terms of analysis, you'll also find that in the booklet itself, the key quotation is identified at the bottom of the poem, and these are the key questions that students have been asked to look at when they're approaching that one. So we'll look at the quotation, it was an act of stealth and trouble pleasure, and then students are beginning to think about each of these key points. So you've got perspective and narrative, and then it gets progressively more difficult when you begin to look at language and the imagery used. That will pop up on the slide. It won't be part of the booklet itself. So if there are key questions that you think actually students are really quite secure on, so for instance, if you had like a top set year 9 class and you felt that perspective or narrative, they've actually already secured that quite quickly when you were doing your questioning earlier on, you might want to replace that with a different question. That's completely fine. The only thing I would say is try not to detract too far away from the language and imagery questions, because those are the ones that will help support their analysis. So this is a planning grid taken towards the end of the week. They've been looking at the prelude, and once they've been looking at through, they've got their point, the first idea, the key quotation that's been given to them as the key quotations that they found at the bottom of the poem in their booklet. And again, words, features to really focus on in their analysis. And just by kind of carving out what they're going to say about the points they're going to make within that poem and supporting them in this way is a good way of structuring quite a complex response to a task as well. An earlier example of the students completing independent practice that was more focused on analysis, but equally the independent practice could just be a piece of creative writing, and here you've got sort of 5 tasks in the pink boxes that help them to kind of work the image, and you'll notice that by the wording of them, directly drawing from what they've done previously and their understanding of the prelude in earlier lessons. So it's this idea of developing a piece of writing that's been inspired by it and almost kind of capturing the writer's use of language in a really effective way. That's the end of this Amuse Bouche for Year 9 Power and Conflict Poetry. If you have any questions or queries, please speak to your link director and they'll be happy to help.